I'm here at the Federal Judicial Center with Timothy Huebner, the Irma O. Sternberg Professor of History at Rhodes College in Tennessee. He's been teaching at Rhodes for more than 20 years, and he's also been Associate Editor of the Journal of Supreme Court History since 2011. His research interests include the Southern judiciary, the American law of slavery, and the relationship between culture and constitutionalism. His first book, The Southern Judicial Tradition, State Judges and Sectional Distinctiveness, 1790 to 1890, explored the impact of Southern culture on the judicial decisions of 6 of the region's leading 19th century judges. His second book, The Tawny Court, Justices, Ruling, and Legacy, examines the justices, major opinions, and overall legacy of the Supreme Court under Roger B. Taney. Today, we're going to talk about his new book, Liberty and Union, the Civil War Era and American Constitutionalism, which is literally hot off the press from the University Press of Kansas. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Claire.
So the Civil War era, what time period does that encompass exactly?
So the book deals with the period from roughly the middle of the 1840s through the 1880s, and I focused then on the antebellum era through Reconstruction. I felt like if I was going to write a book on the Civil War and understand what changed, that the only way to do that would be to look at what happened prior to the war and what happened after the war. So the book tries to do all of that.
And your topic is how Americans in the Civil War era understood the handiwork of the Founding Fathers, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. What does American constitutionalism in the title mean exactly?
Well, the book is all about founding principles and constitutional values. So I'm very interested in how justices of the Supreme Court, presidents, but also African Americans, soldiers, Northerners and Southerners of every sort of political stripe, how all of them made references to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as they were arguing over the political issues of the middle of the 19th century. So the book really focuses on this whole notion of founding principles and constitutional values.
The scope of the book is very ambitious. Why not simply write a narrative history of the Civil War?
Well, it is ambitious, and as I said, I was really trying to tell a big story and was really trying to understand what the Civil War meant and what it changed. And so I started by getting into the antebellum era and trying to understand how Americans during that period looked at the U.S. Constitution and how those values shaped their sort of political and policy debates. And that then, of course, took me into the war and into Reconstruction. So it is a big book, but it tries to lay all that out in a narrative fashion so that readers can see the sweep of change in the middle of the 19th century.
And you organized the book along 3 historiographical streams. You have Civil War history, U.S. constitutional history, and African American history. So let's examine each of these. Let's first start with Civil War history. What was your approach, and were you trying to tell the story of the conflict through a new lens?
Well, yes, I was. Going back to your comment, these 3 different groups of scholars haven't always spoken to each other. So Civil War scholars are off in their own sort of world, writing about the battles of the war and to some extent politics. Constitutional scholars focused on the Supreme Court for the most part. And then those who focus on the history of African Americans have focused on African American activism and the end of slavery during this period. So I was trying to tie all those things up. When it comes to Civil War scholars, there's been an interesting sort of evolution in the writing of the history of the Civil War. For a long time, especially through the middle of the 20th century, the Civil War was written about basically as a brothers' war, as a white man's war. And so in the middle of the 20th century, scholars who were writing about the war really wrote with almost heroic emphasis or slant. By the end of the 20th century, that had changed somewhat. After Vietnam, writers became a little bit more cynical about war. And what they started to emphasize by the end of the 20th century was the enormous violence and death and destruction that was wrought by the war. So that's sort of the background when it comes to how Civil War scholars have focused on the war. By bringing in African American history, I'm trying to argue perhaps that the war was heroic, but in a different way from how scholars had written about previously back in the middle of the 20th century.
So in terms of constitutional history, what was the prevailing constitutional culture in that era? And was it different for white Southerners versus Northerners?
So constitutional values were at the heart of the sectional political debates of the 1840s and 1850s. And one of the interesting things, if you look at constitutional values in the 1840s and 1850s, is that most Northerners in the 1840s tended to recognize the whole notion that Southerners had certain rights under the U.S. Constitution when it came to slavery. They recognized the right of slavery to exist in the southern states, understanding it as a state institution, and they also recognized the sort of rights of Southerners when it came to being able to recapture fugitive slaves who had fled into the North. One of the things that really struck me as I was getting into this work is that I realized that in terms of the language of rights in the 1840s and 1850s, mostly politicians north and south were arguing over the rights not of slaves, but of slaveholders. And ultimately then, that issue was dealt with by the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, in 1857 in the landmark case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. So there was an enormous emphasis on the Constitution, most often framed in terms of how many rights did Southern slaveholders actually have? And that then is the key sort of question that will end up in secession and Civil War.
So you mentioned the Supreme Court. What role did the court play in creating and affirming the pro-slavery constitutional order?
Right, so this is a critical question in the 1850s because even if Northerners were willing to accept the idea that Southerners had rights to hold slaves in the southern states, and even if they were willing to accept the idea that they had the right to recapture fugitives in the North, the third right that Southern slaveholders claimed turned out to be the most controversial of all, and that was whether Southerners had the right to take slaves into new federal territories in the West. And that was what led to the organization of a new political party in the middle of the 1850s, the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's the nub of the issue in Dred Scott. In that case, in 1857, a constitutional landmark, Chief Justice Roger Taney holds that the right to own slaves is constitutionally protected in every sense, mm-hmm. which means then that Southerners have that third right, which they were claiming, to take their slave property into the West. Abraham Lincoln and his party obviously disagreed with that. That meant then that a showdown was of course, going to happen mm-hmm. once Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Dred Scott. How significant was that decision? I mean, was it really one of the most important cases in U.S. constitutional history?
Well, I would argue that it was, and I actually set up the book so that one of the chapters ends in 1857, so as to make the point that if you have one section of the country, Southerners, mm-hmm. white Southerners, who by 1857 think that their rights have been vindicated by the court, So this question that has been in national politics for at that point about 10 or 11 years, ever since the war with Mexico in 1846. So if you have one section of the whole country, Southerners, who think that their constitutional rights have been upheld and that the question has been settled, but you have not a whole section of the country, but most of the people in the northern states who didn't accept that ruling, and you had a whole political party that was founded on the opposite principle, which was the idea that those western territories ought to be free, and that ought to be free soil. That meant that you had a serious break in terms of how those two sections understood the Constitution, which meant that the antebellum pattern of compromise was not likely to happen. So that whole notion of some way for us to figure out a compromise. There had been a compromise over the question of slavery in Missouri in the 1820s. There had been a whole sort of set of questions having to do with whether slavery ought to extend into the West in the late 1840s, and they were able to solve that temporarily with a sectional compromise in 1850. But by 1857, compromise was not possible because of the extent of constitutional polarization.